Thank you very much, and thank you for your excellent presentation. I'm really not an expert on Katyn, of course. Janusz was very generous. What I mentioned to him is that I find Russian-Polish relations very important for the reason that basically Russia's relations with the West is centered around Poland. And also there is a question of Russian identity that is also very much tied to Poland, and that's why I think Katyn obviously has an even greater significance than it would have probably with another country, although we wouldn't know. What I wanted to start with is that a year ago, actually a year ago, just last May, there was a presidential commission established, and the commission, Russian Presidential Commission, President Medvedev is overseeing it, to investigate cases of historical revisionism of World War II. And the cases were considered the ones that are favorable to Russia. One, the case of 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The second one is indeed that Katyn massacre, whether it was a Nazi's fault that in 1940 over 20,000 Polish officers and priests and Polish elite, as they say, was either slaughtered by the Nazis or was slaughtered by the NKVD, the predecessor of KGB, Stalin's secret police. And so and also liberation of Europe, whether the Soviet Union was a liberator of Western Europe or actually an occupier of Western Europe. So these were the three major cases that the commission was to investigate. The argument for the Molotov-Ribbentrop case, and the reason actually you can imagine, because last year was the anniversary of the pact, and therefore this commission was very timely and important, because the arguments were made that, of course, Stalin had no other choice but signing that. I mean, Molotov had no other choice but signing that for Stalin, because basically the only thing that the Soviet Union was doing at the time is with regaining territories that used to be the Russian Empire, which, kind of a flimsy explanation. I mean, the fact that it was a Soviet Empire doesn't necessarily mean that it has to take all the territories of the whole former empire, but yet it was offered as a reason, and that in itself was not entirely correct, because we have a representative of the Moldova Foundation in 1940 when the Soviets kicked out the Romanians from Bessarabia and occupied the northern Bukovina at the time, which actually was never part of the empire. So that in itself was slightly confusing, and yet it was really given as a historical fact. One of the reasons behind that is that in 2004, and I really don't need to go into recent Russian history, but in 2004, then President Putin, as you know now, he's prime minister as of 2008, but in 2004 he was still president in his second term. Russia was great, and he really decided that Russia is great. Stalin is even greater, and history is entirely on the Russian side, which is Russia has nothing to regret, as great as it is. The firm belief since 2004 that the Russian people are the liberators of Europe, and there was no other way of looking at it. And then the Katyn was certainly the Nazis' fault, and of course the Soviets had nothing to do with that. And in fact, that was kind of an interesting, well, it wasn't entirely that interesting, but very disappointing development, because when Mikhail Gorbachev studied his perestroika and glasnost, it was well established that, in fact, the Katyn massacre was the case of the Soviets, and Yeltsin continued 10 years later. We back to square one, that is, back to this kind of Stalin-era mythology and Soviet mythology that the thing is in fact our fault. What interests me today is that 12 months later, so now it's 2010, May 2010, Katyn is back as what it was in 1940, and then back what it became in history in the late 1980s and then in the 1990s, which is Stalin's NKVD slaughter. And Putin himself admitted it. And, you know, of course, Russia being Russia, so there's always this conflicting narratives and there's always qualifications because ultimately we're never guilty. And the qualification, as you may remember, was that, yes, Stalin was horrible, but yet Stalin was avenging his own troops that the Polish slaughtered 10 years prior. As if, you know, that tragedy could kind of even it up. But anyway, at least there was an admission finally, yet again. So what happened in a year is that Stalin is no longer as great as he was. Even as great as he was in the fall of 2009, you may remember that in Moscow Kurskaya station, Moscow subway Kurskaya station, his name on display, and in fact it is in letters. So don't get me wrong, Stalin is still great, but he also got qualified, which is kind of a step forward. That is, it was admitted, and President Medvedev admitted it himself a few times, that he's finally now called a dictator. But of course, he was good for his people because, you know, Second World War. And then, as you know, in Russia, it's a great patriotic war. So while the rest of the world actually fought the global war, Russia particularly, Soviet Union particularly, fought our own war, almost sort of us against all. So there was still these two conflicting narratives that seemed not to be conflicting at all. So he was a dictator, but that was good nonetheless. So if you ask me why the change, basically what I work on is the sort of contemporary politics and culture, is that I actually think the economic crisis really made the Russians running. And in a sense, there was, since the fall, there was an understanding that, remember that great Soviet slogan, building communism in a separately taken country? I think there was a decision that you cannot really fight a global crisis, economic crisis, in a separately taken country. So Russia started acting in a slightly civilized manner. So I don't know if this is permanent, because I actually find Russians' behavior after the, not only with the admission of Katyn, but after Kaczynski, President Kaczynski and his colleagues tragically died almost un-Russian, or certainly un-Putin Russian. So I don't know whether it was going to last, or maybe the oil goes up again, we're going back to our great self again, I don't know. But yet, I think it's a very important change that has happened. And hopefully we're not going to go back to that Russia is great, unqualified. This panel, and I will conclude with that, is called The Power of Truth. And I think what really is more important with the Russians, or with Russia altogether, is that it's not capable of telling the truth. I mean, the facts are there, and often are there. But even when it tells the truth, there are all these qualifications. You know, the facts are this, but there's on the other hand. And I think for Russia from now on, and I hope it may happen, is more important than admitting the truth, because that has been done. I mean, with Katyn, indeed, was done by Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and back again to what Katyn really was. But it's the admission of guilt, and I think that's where we really have work to do quite a bit. The mea culpa is really something that that hasn't worked out with us as much. And one of the things I wanted to conclude with, I don't know how fresh you remember Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs, but there was a very interesting document because, as you know, desalinization started there and then, and it was a good step forward. And yet, when you read the memoir, it was sort of Stalin was this, and the 20 million people died, and the Second World War, in fact, was problematic because before the war started, the Russian military elite, Soviet military elite was slaughtered, and therefore there were immense losses. And yet, Khrushchev concludes almost every single paragraph is that But all in all, Stalin was really very important for the world communist movement, and therefore he was very important. All in all, he was an important leader for Russia. And I think that that's what the major problem in Russia is, that we're still there, that the truth and the facts should be stripped of the mythology that makes us look good, and in fact, the admission of guilt would be something that we should go forward with. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nina.